All right, for this one, we're joined by the Athletics' Adam Crafton, Mark Critchley, and also the man who broke the story and the internet, I've been told, late last night, our football correspondent, David Ornstein. David, let's start with you then, right? How did Manchester United arrive at this decision?
Yeah, I think it's been a long and quite well documented process because so much of it has played out publicly. But clearly, when INEOS arrived and took sporting control of Manchester United in the early part of 2024, they would have had their own thoughts, even leading up to that point when they were in the process to try to acquire their minority shareholding in the club, as to whether they should make a managerial change. Should they stick with Ten Hag? Who are the other potential candidates? That's not unusual for owners and investors as they come into a club. Now, contributing to that was a really poor season for Manchester United in the Premier League and in the Champions League as well. And there were so many issues around it, such as Mason Greenwood, Jadon Sancho, Anthony, the injuries, the style of play. And it didn't get particularly better at any point. Your mind casts back to days like Fulham at Old Trafford and Brentford and Bournemouth and Crystal Palace, of course. And I think the concerns were starting to manifest themselves on both sides, Manchester United's hierarchy and also, I'm sure, on Ten Hag's as well. I don't think that's anything sensationalist. I just think it's fairly normal given the circumstances. And it came to the point where United will have been looking at other options in case they were going to be making a change. They would have been studying them. They would have been speaking to them. They would have been studying Ten Hag. It appears speaking to him less. There was definitely some feelings towards making a change, and that started to come out publicly. But I don't think it was sort of set in stone. They had quite a few matches in that period too. You'll remember, I think it was sort of Arsenal and Newcastle and Burnley, or was it Brighton? I can't remember every single game. And so, each time I think the consensus was to make a change. They maybe then held back, or maybe it was towards being patient and then going the other way. I think this was a sort of hour by hour, day by day, week by week assessment. And it clearly got to a point where a change was looking most likely. And just before the cup final, there were all manner of reports about meetings that were being held with the likes of Kieran McKenna, Maurizio Pochettino, Thomas Frank, Roberto De Zerbi. There's no doubt that the fan sentiment, the public sort of atmosphere, the nature of that victory, and against the might of Manchester City, the way it affected his record of 2 trophies in 2 seasons, plus another final as well, Champions League football qualification the previous year. When you bring that all together, it gives you a lot of food for thought. And yet it didn't stop them from holding meetings and conversations with potential candidates. And let's not shy away from the fact that, if they had found the perfect candidate, maybe we'd be having a very different conversation right now. But it seems that they didn't, for whatever reason, whether it was the candidates themselves, whether it was them increasingly thinking they had the best person in the building already, whether it was the finances involved in paying off Ten Hag or acquiring a new manager, head coach. They finally came to a decision amongst themselves at the hierarchy of the club to stick with Erik Ten Hag. And then it was about talking to him finally, because I think there'd been radio silence for quite a long time as they deliberated, as this review took place without Ten Hag. And they had to broach the topic with him, and they went to see him. It sounds like they had some healthy conversations, and the outcome was that Erik Ten Hag would be staying and that they would enter negotiations over a new contract. He has 12 months left on his existing deal. There's an option to extend that by a further 12 months. But now they will talk about, prolonging that further and maybe rewarding him for what he's done so far, for the circumstances that he's had to deal with, the class and dignity that he's shown throughout. We'll have to see if that actually happens, the new contract. But for now, finally, we have some concrete clarity on the managerial situation at Manchester United, and now they'll look to crack on with the summer transfer window and preparations for what should be a fascinating third year in charge for Erik Ten Hag at Manchester United.
Yeah, definitely want to go into that a little later on. But Adam, I guess this is yet again another situation that seems to have played out. I guess the nature of it, if you use David's words, as I don't know, for me, a bit messy, but I don't think that's any like other situations at Manchester United over the last couple of seasons in general. But from your perspective, what do you make of that decision, the process itself, and also how the club has justified it?
Um, it's strange in the sense of, we know that Manchester United were speaking to other managers last week, right? So therefore, if they were speaking to other managers last week, it makes it difficult to take at face value, what they are now attempting to convey to the media, which is that they were so impressed by the FA Cup final, that they have been so taken by the way Ten Hag develops young players, that they have so much, time for Ten Hag's approach with, the respect he's shown and all of this kind of stuff. So it's definitely been an odd one. I think, it was interesting. The media got a lot of criticism in the week leading up to that FA Cup final, for putting out reports which were stating the facts in relation to Manchester United starting to reach out to entourages of other managers. But that was true. And that in itself created a lot of pressure for Ten Hag on that final, and a lot of pressure on the players for that final. And it created a kind of chaos around that final that probably in the end weirdly helped United, in that that day started to feel like such a free hit. There was so little expectation. I know it sounds like a very weird thing to describe a Manchester derby in an FA Cup final as a free hit, but there was such chaos around that game, such a sense of who knows what's going to happen. Ten Hag was the most, in some ways, relaxed I've ever seen him in his interviews, because he was kind of saying things like, look, if they don't want me, I'll just go and win trophies somewhere else. And laying into Roy Keane a little bit on ITV, laying into Alan Shearer a little bit on BBC, all things that were absolutely fair, but it was kind of the most liberated version of Ten Hag I've really seen at United. So it's been a strange process. It's certainly, the evidence is that United had serious doubts about keeping him. The evidence is that they have spoken to several other managers, that Ten Hag himself didn't really appear to be hugely involved personally in this review process, which kind of gave us the impression as we went along that these reviews have almost become innuendo. It felt like that at Chelsea for, we're going to let you go, because why are you really having the review if you're not going to do that? So yeah, strange process. I think it's probably taken a couple of weeks out of Manchester United's progress, perhaps in the transfer market as well, which will be a concern to fans. They've got a lot to do in terms of ins and outs, and it doesn't mask. One game against Manchester City, as fantastic as it was, the emotion of that doesn't mask the fact that Manchester United finished eighth, negative goal difference. We're out of the Champions League before Christmas. And their midfield was ran through week in, week out for the whole season. So I think, although Ten Hag has bought himself a lot of favour with that trophy, it still surprises me a little bit that we've gone from Manchester United talking to Thomas Tuchel last week to 3 more years, right? Like it's potentially with a new contract. So it'll be interesting to see how the responsibilities of Ten Hag, whether it's recruitment, potentially change, or whether there ends up being some sort of break clause in that contract.
Yeah, Critch, I'm sure many of us were probably thinking, you know what, it's probably time to start talking about the Euros at some point. But here we are talking about Manchester United. Gareth Southgate isn't a good manager, but for a job this specific, Manchester United, the candidates probably weren't the strongest, as you'd probably like to see.
Yeah, that was always a sort of issue underpinning this process that United have been through. And, it was explained to me on a number of occasions that if they're determined to move on from Erik Ten Hag, that decision will be taken in isolation, and then they will tackle the replacement separately. But it's impossible to think that those lines don't blur at some point, because you really can't, unless there is all-out rancor and it's become so poisonous that Ten Hag can't continue with the staff, with the execs, with the players, then yeah, I understand how it can be separated. But there wasn't that, and there were mitigations and reasons to keep going with Ten Hag. And when you look at those they were looking at, there was no sort of Pep Guardiola or Jurgen Klopp figure out there, and it was quite remarkable with hindsight. And I say this with total respect to the person I'm about to mention, but Kieran McKenna was very much in the frame. 2 seasons at Ipswich Town in League One and the Championship, a really exciting prospect, and we wish him only the best in his managerial career. And yeah, there was a link because he'd worked at Manchester United before, but he was spoken to and seemed very much in the frame before deciding to sign a new contract with Ipswich, as I understand it, because he didn't receive any guarantees from Manchester United. He was also in the frame for Chelsea and Brighton. But that's just extraordinary to think that, he was so closely considered for the job at Manchester United Football Club at such an embryonic stage of his career. And then when you look at, say, a Tuchel, there were moments in this journey where I was having conversations that made very clear to me that he was not going to get this job. He was not the sort of manager they were looking for. Maybe it was clouded somewhat by his experiences at Bayern Munich and Chelsea and PSG, which have definitely not gone too smoothly. And Manchester United would be looking for a different type of profile at this point. De Zerbi clearly came strongly into the frame. And look, he's regarded as being one of the best coaches around, but not without concerns that have been sort of raised quite publicly, and also his track record to this point wouldn't normally put you wouldn't normally put him in the Manchester United sphere from what we've come to know of a club of that level. Maurizio Pochettino, of course, he came very close last time round when Erik Ten Hag got it, but having seen what happened at Chelsea and PSG, he's recently out of Chelsea, and I'm not sure that would have been the easiest situation either. Where else did they look? To people like Thomas Frank? Well, again, somebody I'm so impressed with the way he's done his job at Brentford, but it is a completely different, and with respect, a much smaller environment than Manchester United, and they didn't have the greatest season last time round. A lot of injuries as a mitigation for him as well. But this is an enormous step up for him, despite the fact that he comes across so well and is very popular. Marco Silva was another we heard they spoke to, and Ruben Amorim considered in some way, shape or form. INEOS, in their first major decision in terms of the footballing environment, or their biggest decision since coming into the club, they really couldn't afford to get this wrong. And there are so many risks entailed in every decision, but particularly when you were looking at those candidates without the one that everybody could have got behind, as Mark says. And so, and I'd spoken before saying on occasions almost to have is to hold, because there's going to be a lot of clubs looking at somebody like Ten Hag. Bayern Munich were heavily linked to him. Ajax on a return if he became available. The fact that Manchester United appointed him in the first place shows the sort of level that he's regarded at. And whatever you think of his performance so far, out of all of those people, maybe Tuchel aside, who has worked for some of the biggest clubs in the world, essentially the Emir of Qatar at PSG, for Roman Abramovich at Chelsea, for their American billionaires now, for the executives at the great Bayern Munich. But aside from that, Erik Ten Hag has learned what it is to be a Manchester United manager. He's made mistakes, of course, but that's quite a unique sort of skill set and experience. Not everybody could, not many people could come in and easily adapt to that environment, with the change, with the politics, with the dressing room personalities and the egos and the sort of the earnings of those players and the transfer fees involved. And I think, as you reflect on it, as the news came out, and you see the reaction of the public, as Mark touches upon, it did actually feel like, to me anyway, the right decision for that moment. And 2 weeks, Adam points out, it felt like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't, months. I remember the Tottenham process. Was it when they ended up appointing Nuno Espirito Santo? And everyone had a counter on the number of days. When it got up past 70 days, it became something to stick to beat them with. Whereas, Manchester United are done and dusted now, whatever has gone before. And they're on their summer holidays, Euros, Copa America, and then they come back for pre-season, and they've got the man who always said he was going to be continuing, or he thought it, he was planning ahead. And a lot of water has gone under the bridge. There's going to be some repairing that needs to be done in terms of relationships between himself and the hierarchy, himself and some players within the dressing room itself. We can't just sweep those issues under the carpet. But, Adam's right. It didn't sit comfortably that they were, meeting these candidates behind his back. But equally, they might argue that as they move towards this head coach model, or way of working that INEOS seem to want to institute, with your technical director, your sporting director, this modern sort of continental model, they wanted to speak to other people and see if it was those that they wanted, or if it was Ten Hag that they wanted. And if it's Ten Hag that they wanted, what can they learn from those candidates that they can hopefully ask him to adapt to in their way of working? Because I think he will have to change somewhat, whether it's removing the veto that he has in transfers, whether it's keeping it, but just taking on board slightly different ways of working, this game model that Jason Wilcox is said to be overseeing, whether it's not having a say or as much of a say in recruitment business. But, sometimes you do go and look at other things. When you're a property owner, you might go and look at other houses, and then you ultimately decide that, no, they're not right for me, and this is the house that I'm in now is fine, and we're going to stay. The difference with that is that properties don't have feelings and people do, and it felt a little disrespectful at times towards Ten Hag, but the way he's conducted himself is clearly appreciated by Manchester United. When they went over and held these talks with him, I think it was in Ibiza, I think there was some contrition there on the part of Manchester United, and they will like to think that out of this, as you describe it, mess, comes a little bit of calm and a better relationship going forward. And now let's see if they can work together.
It's interesting what you say, David, around what happened in the week before the final, because I think the important context of this is kind of Chelsea kind of blew everyone's world open when they decided to change their manager and let Mauricio Pochettino leave the club, because that kick-started a process of their own. And all of a sudden, many of the people, although I don't think Enzo Maresca would ever have been someone Manchester United would have hired, that may be wrong, other people that they were speaking to, certainly Kieran McKenna, potentially Thomas Frank, were the kinds of managers that Chelsea also would have looked at. So once Chelsea became active in that market, you have to remember as well, Manchester United had this board meeting in Monaco where the consensus at that meeting was that Manchester United were likely to make a change. This was before the FA Cup final. As David said, it wasn't set in stone, but the feeling coming away from that meeting was the best thing for United to move forwards is to change their manager. So if that's the way they're thinking, and then all of a sudden one of their big Premier League rivals is in the market, and you have to remember at this time as well, Barcelona were hiring a manager, Bayern Munich were hiring a manager, other teams. I mean, it feels like everyone's been looking for a manager at different. Liverpool, obviously, a little bit earlier. So United kind of had to be active, and that would have led many people in that week leading up to the final to sort of say United were being, lacking class or being disrespectful towards Ten Hag. But if that's the way that they were thinking at that time, and you have to remember this was, preceding the FA Cup final, which nobody expected them to win, I think United kind of had to be doing that at that point. And if they weren't doing that, and then they'd missed out on people that they felt were best for the job, then it would have been criticism of a different kind, saying, they were too slow, that they weren't on the ball, all of this kind of stuff. So I don't think it was an enviable position for the club necessarily to find itself in. And also, people may have been saying over the past few days, as more stuff came out about Thomas Tuchel and other managers, why is Ten Hag putting up with this? Well, he's putting up with this because if you hang around long enough at a football club, you tend to get paid off, and you're not going to walk away for no money at all when you could potentially get paid off. So for him, it was probably a sense of, look, either I get paid off and we shake hands, walk away, mutual agreement, etc., or I somehow come out of this with Manchester United holding talks with me in Ibiza, showing contrition, and giving me a contract after delivering their worst season in God knows how long. So I think from Ten Hag's point of view, he's kind of come away with it with a huge amount of sympathy, and potentially an even stronger position. So, and in between all that, he did contribute in a quite sensational way to that FA Cup final. And, all sorts of stuff went into that, and video montages, Al Pacino speeches. I mean, pretty kind of extraordinary day. And also there was a real vindication of his development of United's two best young players in Mainu and Garnacho scoring the goals that won that game. And I think that probably did have an impact. And also the fact that he showed some tactical flexibility after a season in which he hadn't shown very much of it really, by having that kind of 4-2-4 system, dropping Højlund to the bench, having McTominay and Fernandes as strikers. And also he was vindicated, and he'd spent all season saying how important it was to have Lisandro Martinez fit. And then Lisandro Martinez was fit and they played better. So I think at the same time, a lot of people will think going into next season, they can't be that dependent on the fitness of someone who has been pretty injury prone over the last 18 months. Same with Luke Shaw as well. So it'll be interesting to see what United do in that market, but also not sure Manchester United are going to have that much money to spend this summer. And that's going to be a potentially limiting factor in, how much progress they're able to make.
Yeah, Critch. I mean, the FA Cup. Let's speak about that. Look, I mean, that's 2 cups now under his tenure at Manchester United, and it's fair to say he'll say, "Yeah, man, look where we were before. Look what I've brought to the club in my time." Right. And as Adam's just pointed out, the emergence of young players as well. Did we get a sense from that FA Cup with a relatively fit squad what Manchester United are potentially capable of under Erik Ten Hag?
Look, I think throughout this process, we said that we shouldn't judge it on one game, and it's difficult to say that they didn't judge it on one game when we know what
Well, they were all
happened.
fit. You can basically say, "Look, I've got these lads fit, and look what I want to do." And we beat Manchester City, the best team potentially in the world. I mean, that's a really big one for him, easily.
Absolutely, look, I'm not denying that whatsoever. I think the day itself was, I agree with everything, echo everything Adam said before about it just being a manic day in which we barely comprehend what was happening. Something of a free hit, yes. But then I don't know if we would have been saying that if they'd lost either. We would have said that all this pressure, all this scrutiny had told them they collapsed under it, but they didn't, right? And I think absolutely Ten Hag deserves credit for that. And look, the 2 trophies thing, the 2 trophies in 2 years, yeah, that is success. That is the bottom line. Is it the bottom line? I don't know though, because our trophy is really a measure of success. I don't think that we go through the psychodrama of the last fortnight if Ten Hag's record over the past 2 seasons is the same as Mikel Arteta's, for example. He doesn't have a trophy to show for what he's achieved. And Arteta's been a regular kind of comparison point throughout this debate about Ten Hag. People advocate for Ten Hag, saying, look at Mikel Arteta, he was given time. Look what Arsenal produced now. They're in a position to win trophies. Ten Hag, I think, has now won more trophies than Arteta has in almost twice as long in the job, right? But who's in a better position to challenge for more? That, I think, is the bigger question. You know, this is something that Solskjaer used to mention a lot, actually, when he was in the job. Maybe out of his own self-interest, because he didn't manage to win that first trophy for United either. But he would always say, look at the performances. I look at performances. I look at where we finish in the league as signs of progress. That tends to be the way that we judge managers nowadays. And yes, there's this parallel, if you like, with Fergie, with United in 1990 winning the FA Cup. There's Mark Robins in there, as we mentioned as well, with Coventry. There's all these eerie kind of ghosts from the past that have come in this run, and maybe this is the turning point. Maybe this is where it all starts to the trajectory goes upwards for Ten Hag from now on. But we judge managers on a very different basis now that compared to how we did nearly 34 years ago. And I feel that that will be more of the way that Ten Hag is judged going forward under INEOS and yeah, more widely as well.
Yeah, and David, can we also judge him on, and Adam mentioned it, and so has Critch, on what he's done with those youngsters? Garnacho, Højlund to a certain degree, Maino for sure has been quite standout this season. But then what does that also mean for certain players like Casemiro, Sancho, for instance, as well?
Yeah, there's sort of praise and blame on both sides, I guess you could say. Going back a while, the Frankie de Jong pursuit was possibly a bit naive by all involved, because he never wanted to join Manchester United. So it didn't matter that they struck an agreement with Barcelona, because the player was not going to agree terms with them. He wanted to stay. That wasted a lot of time and energy. They ended up with a bit of a panic dash for Casemiro, ended up paying too high a transfer fee and salary that is now a bit of a millstone around their neck. They might try and move him on this summer. Most notable one was Antony. Definitely a feeling that they overpaid for him, and there have been complications off the pitch as well. And that's the sort of thing that the INEOS regime will just not tolerate going forward. From everything we hear, they'll want to put a much more diligent process in place to try and ensure that United make good value for money signings. I suspect they'll be looking towards the young bracket and lower fees. I think our colleague Laurie Whitwell has reported about agents being aware that it's sort of a £50 million budget, unless there are sales to bring it higher. I've heard similar figures, or maybe even a bit lower, but the big question there is potential sales. So yeah, there's lots of questions about how they've recruited and the senior players, as you point out there, and you know, in normal circumstances, you wouldn't be bringing sort of a Johnny Evans back into the squad, who was just there at Carrington to regain his fitness, although he did really well and he might now get a new contract. But that's a sort of strange dynamic that has developed there. I've seen some social media posts, I think, from Garnacho's brother in support of Ten Hag before this decision was made and subsequent to the news emerging too. So there's clearly some bonds there that we shouldn't underestimate. You know, Rasmus Højlund that you touch upon, big money transfer. Again, the fee was higher than Manchester United would have liked, and some would say that they could have got him for earlier in that transfer window. But again, he's given him his chance, and yeah, the goal return hasn't been spectacular, but you know, we know the threat and the potential that he carries when he's been fit and available. And in the side, he was not meant to be the first choice striker. I don't think they wanted a more senior striker. Ten Hag wanted Kane, didn't get him, and then by default, Højlund comes in and is the front man. And there are those stories all over the squad. That's why this is a far more complex picture than many seem to paint. You know, there have been reasons why Ten Hag decided to favour an Antony at the end of that summer transfer window, because targets that he wanted earlier were not available or couldn't be landed. And then, yeah, he agreed, and he knows many of these players, and we can't get away from that. You know, even Christian Eriksen had worked with him in training at Ajax, and Andre Onana. You can scrutinise the fee they paid for him and the decision to go with him. You know, Erik Ten Hag is not beyond scrutiny on all of these things, but there are various ways in which these transfers developed. It wasn't his decision to spend that money on them. He doesn't write the checks. And so I think a bit of sympathy on that front. But all in all, he has forged a squad that the candidates that they were speaking to, from what I hear, were all very enthusiastic. Maybe you would say this in an interview or in a discussion about working with this limited budget and the existing players in the first team squad and more coming through from the academy. Credit to the way Man United continue to produce young talent, and getting the best out of the resources available, and that there is talent there. And we've seen Marcus Rashford have a 30-goal season the season before last, and so we know the player that's in there. And so I don't think it's as bad as many like to portray, in terms of what United have at their disposal. They will need to use the market effectively. They want a centre back, they want a midfielder, they want a striker. There may be a need for a left back. So there's work to be done, and there's going to, now comes the moment where they need to crack on with that. We know they like a Jared Branthwaite. They wanted Benjamin Sesko, but obviously they were probably never in at the front of the queue for him, and he's now staying at Leipzig, so they'll have to look elsewhere. And it will be the job of like a Jason Wilcox as technical director, Matt Hargreaves, who's head of sort of football negotiations, supported by incoming chief executive Omar Barada, Dan Ashworth as sporting director, if and when they manage to get him into the club, and the INEOS hierarchy now in sporting control, to really try and mold a squad that is of a high level and can compete and do so consistently. And that will take time, and it will take windows, and they're going through what like an Arsenal and a Liverpool and others have done. It's their turn now, and they've got to deliver.
David, it's also just what we're saying there about the size of United's budget this summer. If we're talking about a net spend 40 to 50 million, I think that it emphasizes two things. One is actually, they'd have had to pay Ten Hag off, so that's more money that would have been. Then obviously you'd have a wage package for whoever came in, which may have been a challenge as well. But then also you have this ongoing situation with Dan Ashworth, where we don't know how much Manchester United are going to have to pay Newcastle yet. I think United see it as like a couple of million. Newcastle have been talking about, upwards of 10, 15, 20 kind of thing. So those figures then become really important when you bring in those calculations. But then it's all, when you look at players United have already lost this summer, Varane has gone. That's a lot of money off the wage bill. Martial has gone. It's a lot of money off the wage bill. Then you have this situation with who do they actually get rid of this summer in terms of who do they actually make money out of? And I think, certainly I think with Erik Ten Hag staying, you would expect Jadon Sancho to go. Mason Greenwood, I think we expect to go. And then it's maybe, is that the extent of it? Or do they go and try and sell? Last summer there was a lot of talk about selling one of Harry Maguire or Scott McTominay, but they became kind of accidentally really important players as the season went on. And I think one of the things United were keen to convey last night is that the players they signed last summer, they don't feel like they necessarily got the absolute benefit from that they may get this season. So someone like Onana, who got stronger as the season went on, I mean, notwithstanding obviously a mistake in the final, but in general during the last few months, he seemed to get stronger. Mason Mount was injured all season, so in theory, like a new signing potentially. And then also Rasmus Højlund was very much a development player and probably still is in many ways. So I think United look at last summer's business as potentially coming to fruition in some ways the next season. But, if you're talking about someone like Jared Branthwaite, I think Everton are talking 60, 70 million pounds, right? So if you were to sign him, you're not left with that much to go and get a striker, a left back, a holding midfielder. So can they do a deal with the Saudis for Casemiro? Do they get a bailout in some way there potentially? Would anyone take Anthony? Would Ten Hag even want to sell Anthony? And any of these players who leave, you have to replace, and they're not cheap to replace. So it's interesting. It's interesting also in terms of what that FFP calculation really is, given that INEOS have injected a decent amount of cash. So it feels like that net spend is potentially tighter than what it should be, given players are leaving the club as well.
I'll just add a tiny bit on that around recruitment. It is not as easy as some people might think, ourselves included. The Saudi landscape is very different this summer. There are fewer places because the squads were filled last time round. I don't think there will be anywhere near the level of spending that we saw a year ago. They didn't really spend anything in January. They also don't want to just be seen as this league that is being given the Premier League cast-offs and we're the solution to your FFP ills. And therefore, when a lot of reports came up on Casemiro in recent weeks that they're just going to shift him there, I got a very clear message from people I speak to around the Saudi Pro League that firstly, we don't know our budgets yet. They're still trying to formulate them. People from clubs may go rogue and say, yeah, we want this player and that player, and they'll hold conversations with clubs and agents. But I'm not sure the powers that be that make these decisions necessarily want to just automatically take a Casemiro. And if it was so straightforward, I think the wheels would be well in motion by now. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's not as straightforward as clubs such as Man United might think.
David, one other thing, I think that budget might be slightly bigger now that United are in European competition. So they're in Europa League. So
that's a good point.
That probably helps them a little bit. The other bit is if United weren't in Europe, I think they'd have trimmed the squad more brutally, because at that point you've only got one game a week and it's a real opportunity to actually trim the fat. Whereas if you have Europa League responsibilities, and we've seen this has been an issue with Ten Hag, where he's kind of overplayed some players for a couple of years, where he's not rotated heavily. And even in his first season, I mean, he would play Marcus Rashford in like every Europa League game, even in the group stage. So I wonder whether they keep the squad a little bit bigger again to cope with the demands of those different competitions. Because also, I mean, it's all well and good, United saying, oh, it's only the Europa League, but winning trophies is what's kept Ten Hag in a job. And I don't think anyone expects United to win the league next season, but if they can go and win the Europa League and finish third or fourth, right, exactly. I mean, to be fair, if they're in a position where they need to win that to get back in the Champions League, I think they might. He might be a problem again, but it's a fair point. But what I'm saying is, it's not a competition that you can just dismiss, and I don't think it's one that the fans would really want them to dismiss, because United have just not gone very far in European competition for way too long now.
Yeah, and one of the things around Adam's point about more games and Europa League and being competitive is the fitness and availability of the squad, which was a disaster last season. And there's been talk of medical department reviews and changes in there. We've seen, I think, that a physio is coming from Arsenal, Jordan Rees, to join the regime that's led by Gary O'Driscoll, also formerly of Arsenal, and a number of other changes. That they have to get that right. It was just not sustainable at all. And then you'll see a better squad. I mean, some quite concerning comments from Luke Shaw on England duty, sort of blaming himself and the club for his absence and playing when he shouldn't have. That can't continue. And just one final point on the recruitment side, potential departures. It might not be easy in places like Saudi, which is a big issue for all Premier League clubs. But also domestically, if they think they can just shift players to other Premier League clubs, even worse, other European clubs where there's barely any money, especially with this PSR deadline of the 30th of June looming, which makes it, more of a buyer's market, and they're going to try and cut good deals for incoming players. Outgoings are a problem. And so this is, okay, they've got the calm of having sorted out the managerial situation. But if we think it's all going to be plain sailing now, we're mistaken, because there are hazardous days, weeks and months ahead. And that budget is really tight because of the restrictions. So, it's down to the...
Have United resolved their situation in terms of actually being allowed to compete in the Europa League? Because they have this issue, don't they, where Nice, who are also owned by INEOS, have qualified for the same competition, and UEFA rules have tended to mean that two teams owned by the same ownership group, or where the ownership group has a material influence or control, can't both be in the same competition. Are United going to resolve that? Because it's obviously quite important to how they budget in the window.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say about that is that since the very start of the even of the strategic review and the takeover process, once we knew that INEOS were involved, they were absolutely confident that they would be able to satisfy those regulations if United and Nice were in the same competition, and they looked towards precedents that were set last summer. I think with Aston Villa and their multi-club ownership group, AC Milan as well, the Redbird group. There were precedents set there that they felt that would allow them to be able to do it. At the same time, they have had to satisfy those regulations, and I think there was a deadline of Monday, the 3rd of June, yeah, and the expectation is very much so that United and Nice will be allowed to compete in those competitions, and that's never really been too much of a concern. What I think there's wider implications perhaps for what happens within the INEOS multi-club group, if you like, where those resources would go. I think you've seen, I'm correct in saying Nice have lost Farioli, the manager, to Ajax this summer. And just the level of attention and care that's going to be split between those two clubs, because look, I think we all covered Manchester United. We know how demanding it is. Imagine trying to run the place while doing 2 or 3 clubs on the side. I think that is going to be a theme that's going to pop up over the next months, yes, but in terms of the immediate term, and whether they'll be able to compete in the same competition, the expectations that they will once they make the changes that satisfy UEFA's regulations.
Okay, Adam, I'm just thinking about this whole kerfuffle, right? You're interviewing a bunch of managers, considering you've got one already in place, and I'm seeing Erik Ten Hag there, just looking around, thinking, I mean, talk to me. Realistically, what does that relationship look like moving forward? I mean, trust is really important, right? But also, can United afford to get it wrong again in August, to start, the season badly, and also not make the right recruitment again? And then you've got a whole heap of stuff again coming into next season of why Man United aren't performing that well. Is this the right manager for the job? Is INEOS the people to take Manchester United to the next level? It's fair to say relationships are semi-fraught right now.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't there during, whatever discussions have taken place over the past few days. I think also, someone like Erik Ten Hag, he's worked in political environments in places like Ajax, been at Bayern Munich. I think people who work at that level in football now are quite realistic around, you're kind of you're useful until you're useless to these people, to these clubs, and you're pretty disposable at certain times. I think, when he steps back, he'll probably be quite relieved, to be honest. I mean, he oversaw a pretty dreadful season in many ways, and I think he'll have been, even he himself has described it as a rubbish season, and some of the performances as being really, really bad. So I don't think it can be a surprise to him that Manchester United were looking at potentially changing his position. Equally, there is no point of them moving forwards if there's some sort of mutual dislike. At this point, it would be completely pointless and an act of self-harm. So if they're going to sign a new contract, they kind of just have to turn the page, start again, and try and move forwards and work together collaboratively, because that's the only way that you can succeed. I mean, it's relative to United's resources, it feels pretty impossible that they would replicate last season's league performance in another year. So the league position should improve. The extent to which it improves is an open question. I think it's quite a good opportunity for them. When you think Chelsea have a manager who is incredibly unproven at the highest level, Liverpool have a manager who has less experience than Erik Ten Hag. Who else? Tottenham obviously finished the season pretty poorly. Can Arsenal go again? Who knows? Man United beat Man City, so they're better than them now. So as a result of all of that, we don't really know what Newcastle will do. Can Aston Villa replicate what they did last season? That's going to be difficult. So, I think there's a lot of potential there for Manchester United to have a substantially better season. I think what he does have to do is repair some of the relationships in that dressing room. I think the Marcus Rashford one is an interesting situation to see how that develops. He needs to reignite some of that fire within Rashford if Rashford's going to stay at the club. I think Bruno Fernandes needs to see evidence that Manchester United are on the same page as him in terms of their ambitions. That might become an interesting situation after the Euros. And I think that's going to be the case with quite a few players, in terms of futures aren't going to necessarily be resolved until their Copa America or Euros responsibilities are done and dusted. That's a pattern we often see. And that's going to make things really tight because, those tournaments are finishing mid-July and then you're into within 2-3 weeks of the season starting. So this isn't an easy transfer window in any case to handle.
Yeah, for sure. I'll sort of add to that. If a player is half decent in the Euros, how their price spikes up. Let's see how Man United deal with that with the budgets. Gents, thanks so much for your time, David, Adam, and Mark as well. And also thank you all for listening. There's more on this story over on The Athletic. And also we'll be back on Monday covering the biggest football stories from around the Euros, Copa America, transfers, and also managerial changes. You name it, we've got it. We'll see you then. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.